So our panelists were really good about time, which means there's a good chance here for some Q&A. I'd like to open the audience. We have microphones stationed at various places. It's not working.
It's not on. It says low battery. I'll just use my. Is that better?
That's better.
Yeah. This debate, it seems to me, is a kind of recapitulation of a very strange debate, by analogy, in the American context, which was the exchange of letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And quite contrary to what one might expect, Jefferson, who we think of as the great Democrat, was a supporter of democracy precisely because it produced a kind of meritocracy, right? Because he thought that it would allow people to select the people best able to rule in their interests, while Adams, who we generally think of on a much more federalist, aristocratic side, is very suspicious of the development of an aristocracy, and particularly the development of what Tocqueville came to call an industrial aristocracy, an aristocracy of wealth. And so I wonder if we think about, I was just thinking of some examples of China and Israel, but also of a place like Puerto Rico, where you have citizens whose rights are pretty well protected, but who don't have the right to vote in federal elections, who do vote in local elections. Whether or not the right to vote itself is essential to rights, or and if it isn't, whether or not we don't essentially believe that some of our citizens who don't have the right to vote, wherever they happen to live, and under what conditions they are, aren't in a certain sense always confined to what Tocqueville called a perpetual childhood.
I assume this is directed to the panel as a whole? Do you want me to start?
You can go first.
Okay. Okay. I think probably that it's interesting that you say a perpetual childhood, because I do think that the issue for Tocqueville and for Mill is about something like self-realization, self-development. And I think that certainly that's the way Mill describes the situation in which women are held, that their lack of civil liberties does lead to an arrested development for them as human beings. And to be held in that as by virtue of some category into which you're born, as Mill puts it, is definitely to be held in a minority position, never to be given the benefits of adulthood as socially recognized. So I would say yes.
That is interesting. I was asked a couple of days ago if there is any kind of gray area between being a democracy and not a democracy. And of course, that's what we get here, are different polities, which are more or less democratic. I think that one criterion, whether you do or you do not have the right to vote, is an important criterion, but not something that makes you a democracy or denies that label. So would we say the United States is not a democracy because of Puerto Rico? Well, we'd say that besmirches that halo. I think that goes back to what Kathy was calling culture and I was calling attitude. If that one violation of a right or a denial of a presupposition of rights is broken, then actually if that violation does exist, then that is very essential, but the whole culture might still be a democratic culture in many other aspects. That's why I said that you look at other human rights as well. That is a basic violation or pre-violation, but then there is the culture of or attitude of what you do with other rights. So I don't know what I would say exactly about Puerto Rico. I think that both in China and in Palestine, the culture is a very different culture than one which respects human rights.
I think Hong Kong is another example. Of course, Hong Kong is part of China now, and you have the freedom of speech, you have local level elections, you have academic freedom, and more or less it's been maintained since '97 without the right to vote the territory's most powerful leaders on the basis of universal suffrage. So it seems to be a perfectly decent society. Now, on this issue of childhood, I think much of it comes from the kind of conception of human flourishing that one holds. For Mill, and I agree with you that many of the arguments that the people make today are, he made, although now what's interesting is that they're more empirically kind of well-grounded. But it's also there's a somewhat different assumption of human flourishing that, that the best life is one where you're critical, creative, constantly challenging tradition. But I think, and here maybe I have a more kind of Confucian-inspired or communitarian idea of the good life, where the good life really lies in having key social relations, family relations, relations within the country, between different countries, and between humans and nature. If those are characterized by the absence of peace and respect for diversity, that's a good test of a good society. And I say this because one thing I'm doing now at Tsinghua is we're working on this harmony index. We're trying to measure societies according to how harmonious they are. And harmony here, we mean different social relations, whether A, they respect, that there's characterized by absence of violence, and 2, respect for diversity. And we think that's a pretty good test of how well a society is doing. Now, if you use that as a test, then if people lack the right to vote, but they have rich family relations characterized by diversity within the country, also there's lots of civility and social responsibility, no wars between countries, and respect for nature, and you have, let's say, democracy at local levels, a rule of law, and a more humane system overall, without one person, one vote to choose the top leaders, where the top leaders are chosen, for example, on the basis of exams and performance at lower levels of government. Are the people, could we say that they're characterized by, being put in a state of perpetual childhood? I think that comes from a kind of assumption of, of human flourishing that Mill defends, that I don't think is widely shared, certainly in China, but I think even in other places.
Is this work? Yes, it is. Okay. What I've noticed within my reading is, thinking of particularly Russia and China, that it seemed to me that the change in the political system was negated by the sameness of the culture. In other words, in Russia, there was a certain culture of how things were done under the Tsar. And in the Soviet Union, that same culture existed irrespective of the fact that the governing pattern had been changed from a Tsar to a dictator. The same thing under a different name. But even though they had elections, they still lived in the same manner that they always had lived. They just had the top had changed, but nothing had changed underneath. And that in China, it was a similar sort of thing, where they had changed from an emperor to whatever they call the top now, the circle at the top of the Communist Party, but that the culture of China was the same. And it was still being expressed in the same way. And I've just come from living in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is where Fort Bragg is. And after 7 years, I've come to understand what I was seeing in the governance of Fayetteville, that that democracy is not practiced in Fayetteville. The concept is like a foreign thing that was brought in. And so they nominally have democracy, which becomes more than nominal when they actually have an election. But they're actually working under the same system that existed under slavery. That on a social level and on a political level, they start with God and they go all the way down to the sex offenders, and it's one line. And everybody knows where they are. It's just like, when you come out of West Point and everybody is listed according to a number. And it's the same way in Fayetteville. Everybody's listed, from God all the way down to the bottom. And there's nobody who's equal.
So I wonder if Anat, you might want to take that question. I'm bouncing it to one of the speakers so they can have a response.
I don't know that I have a response except to ask about I trust your experience in Fayetteville, of course, but I'm not sure that I would go along with the description of China or Russia or the idea that only things at the top had changed. At least the people that I've spoken to from Russia, not as much from China, describe such a different cultural both ambiance and custom. Even talk about the question of religion, which you just said, God to the very religion. Religion was outlawed in Russia during the 70 years of that regime, and that we see it now, bursting back on the scene. I think that is because of a connection between the political top and the culture. So I do think that things are more connected than that kind of divorce that you.
Wait, maybe can I just? Oh, sure. Yeah, China is the one major country, perhaps, where there's been the most radical social change over the past 100 years. But having said that, according to empirical research, there is strong support for political meritocracy in China more than other countries, more than some other countries. So that provides some sort of basis, and obviously there are traditional roots for that as well, for those who argue on that political meritocracy is a more kind of realistic project in China. Just let me make one normative point too. About the importance of tradition, and I think this really goes against Mill a little bit, because if you think of meritocracy in science, we want to value a little bit the Millian idea, constantly criticizing tradition, thinking, trying to be original. But in meritocracy in politics, you want leaders too who have a certain respect for traditional ways of doing things. That's one criterion among others. So I think there is again, it goes against this Mill's idea that the best life is when you're constantly criticizing tradition. And what are the political implications of that? I'm not sure that's a good idea to pursue in politics. In science, yes. We want that form of meritocracy in science, but not in politics, I would argue.
We had two hands that went up simultaneously over here. Do you want to?
Yeah, last night the issue was raised, does a state have a right to be wrong? And today we raised the issue, are all human rights equal? And it seems to me, in practice, we've already answered that question. That in terms of intervening in another state, without it being an act of aggression, it is only when life, genocide, mass killing is at stake. We do not intervene without it being an act of aggression to overthrow a tyranny, to say you can't have this law of censorship. All the rights of equality and democracy and elections and minority rights, to attack a state who is wrong in those regards is still considered an act of an aggression, but humanitarian rescue comes into play when life, as the prime human right above all others, is there. And I think this is what we do in practice. Whether it's right in theory, I don't know, but this is certainly what I think we've done in practice. At least I would ask if you think that is part of what this is about.
Well, yes, I think you're right, that it's not just in practice, but there's something incoherent about the idea that one can impose on a nation on a nation's people their civil rights. Obviously, this is not really a possibility. that when we're talking about democracy, and it can't simply be an abstraction that the will of the people is the principle of legitimacy. So I think this panel today is really talking about civil rights, and as I see it, the way in which civil liberties can be formed in such a way as to maintain rights internally for all citizens and equality for all citizens. I hadn't really, I don't think anyone has proposed, and I think Daniel started out by saying, of course, we're not looking here at some interventionist agenda on anyone's part. Right? But I guess the question is, does that then mean that the things that we would intervene in order to stop are different in kind from the rights that we would like to see inside polities, but certainly wouldn't be willing to interfere in order to get?
Can I problematize your question a little bit? And this came up, I think, when Kathy was speaking too. The problem is liberalism, and the solution is liberalism, or at least we're looking at the problem as coming out of great liberal thinkers, and then the solution saying, yes, we want majority rule, but rights have to be there, is also a liberal answer that recognizes minority rights, individual rights, given the majority rule. I do worry about the fact that we're not giving any room here, and I think that started last night even, to non-liberal, post-liberal, postmodern, other ways of thinking about rights. We're accepting international laws coming from the UN with the regular lists and the regular definitions, but there is work being done, and I think it's very important work, coming out against the international promotion of democracy, for instance. First it was development, then it became democratization, and the UN and all of us went in to help countries become democratic. And we're doing all of this from a liberal perspective. There might be other ways to look at all of that, and then the whole discussion would change. We would look differently at the people fighting within these countries, at social movements, rather than at what we do from the outside. And that's not exactly intervention, it's a softer intervention, but I think we should look at it from that angle.
Just add one point. I mean, many of the ancient Chinese thinkers, like Mencius, for example, were very clear that some sort of intervention is justified and to protect what today we would call the right to life. But, you know, to be I agree that as a normative point, that's a wonderful point, but I think in practice, it's often been mixed up with the promotion of democracy ideal, you know, including the case of Iraq. You know, part of the justification that some made was that it's going to help to promote democracy in Iraq. So, you know, Vietnam and so on. So I think that's why we do need to separate very, very clearly the promotion of basic human rights and the promotion of democracy, whereas they're not often separated to the extent they need to be.
Hans,
I have a question for Catherine Gallagher, but maybe I misunderstood you, so you tell me if I misunderstood you. But you said one of your conclusions was that societies or states get better over time in balancing democracy and human rights, and you called this conclusion a banal conclusion. Now, I don't think it is banal. I'm not even sure that it is correct, to be honest. And I would like to ask you, is there real evidence for that? Or doesn't that describe societies as if they were in a kind of smooth learning process? Whereas I'm always struck by the fact that, let's say, the oldest democracies in the world may react to new challenges in ways that are very different from a balancing between democracy and human rights. Just look at the United States after 9/11, or Switzerland, one of the oldest, alleged oldest democracies, and their reaction to in the minaret question. So could you elaborate on that banal conclusion?
And consider that it's a wrong conclusion instead of a banal conclusion. It's the evidence for that has to do with looking at the countries in which human rights violations have been filed. Complaints about human rights violations have most often been filed. And the oldest constitutional democracies don't tend to have as many of those. And that probably has something to do with the fact that these issues are handled internally, so they don't tend to come up they don't bubble up onto the international level as human rights violations. I don't think that it's a matter of balancing at all. I think it's been a matter of wild swings, so that some of the most frightening possibilities inside democracies have been realized in some of the oldest democracies, and so they have been the ones to experience the fear of democracy at very close range, and therefore to build in more and more and more safeguards against the tendencies toward tyranny and toward the tyranny of the majority in democracies themselves. So that's the way I would see it. I wouldn't see it as just, well, we've always been, in this kind of progressive liberal way, working to balance these two principles which do not fit together very well. I see it much more in terms of terrible outbreaks of violations, and then tremendously painful constraints being placed on democracy. That seems to me more the actual dialectic.
Yeah, maybe can I add? I mean, I think it's partly an empirical question too, and there's a good book by Randy Pirnboom called China Modernizes, and he looks at to what extent, what really explains the greater protection of rights, and he finds that it's level of economic development rather than a level of democratization as really the key factor. But again, from a normative point of view, I really want to press this point that you can have rights protection, but if the social relations are terrible, the families are breaking apart, and there's lack of civility and social responsibility in society, and the countries are at war, at tension with other countries, and people are destroying nature. In other words, if society is very unharmonious, I think that's a problem. So the test of social progress shouldn't just be level of rights protection. I think it should be also level of social harmony in society. China won't do well on that, by the way, so I'm not defending the Chinese system at all. Yeah.
Can I be a killjoy for a second about empirical evidence? I don't exactly know what we're looking for in empirical evidence and what it is that we're measuring or able to really summarize. When we look at revolutions, the one thing I've noticed, I'm not the one who noticed it, it's pretty well known, is that we never can predict revolutions. We don't know if it is when everybody looks harmonious and wonderful and then they all get together for a revolution, as was in the first Intifada in Palestine, where everything seemed wonderful and quiet, but because there was no freedom of a certain sense, that broke out, as opposed to our attempts to understand what happened in the Arab Spring, what it was that brought it around. So I don't know if it's economic or social or family or community or very political unrest that gives rise to this.
I think you have one time for one quick question. Maybe, was your hand up before, or you just bring it?
Sorry, can you repeat?
They have judges running, internet decisions on whether or not somebody should be executed. So there's a trend to encourage populist responses in the law rather than letting professional meritocratic judges make the decision
Those are great questions, but I'm only allowed for a short reply. So what are leaders supposed to do? Of course, we need to begin with a theory of good government, and part of the theory of good government is that the leaders have to serve the people. So we want to have a selection mechanism that increases the likelihood that leaders will serve the people, or at least all those who are affected by the interests of government. Now, how do you do that? That's a key issue, and due to lack of time, I'm writing a book on that question now. So, on this issue of meritocracy and democracy, obviously, if the issue is I think you need both. Both are important sources of legitimacy, and it depends on what the issue is. And if it's an issue of life and death, like whether to sentence somebody to death, we have experts on Chinese law here. I don't know if the decisions are made on basis of polls. It's the first time I hear about that. But obviously, for such life and death decisions, you want to have more reflective deliberation and arguably sometimes non-democratic decision-making at place. But if it's local issues, where people are very familiar with the character and abilities of the leaders they choose, if they know what their needs are, whether where to build the road or how much funding there should be for a new school, and where there's a strong sense of community spirit at the level of community, then I think there's a very good case for having as much democracy as possible. But if it's life and death issues or issues of a big country where the decisions will affect, not just the current generation of people, but future generations and the rest of the world, I think there's a good case for more meritocratic decision-making process. But we also think about how to limit their power, and how to reconcile that source of legitimacy with a democratic source of legitimacy. That's also going to be in the book that I'm writing now. My big mistake was writing short pieces and arguing about this without having written the book, and I wish I had done it the other way around.
So join me in welcoming our speakers.